They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.
All right, guys, let's talk about the fourth turning. So I think probably the easiest way for me to introduce the fourth turning is just to share this meme. If you guys have spent a little bit of time on Twitter, I imagine you've already been exposed to it. Adam, have you seen this meme before?
Yes, absolutely.
All right. So the concept here is hard times create strong men create good times create weak men, and weak men create hard times. And the general argument you'll hear or the sentiment you'll see on Twitter or Instagram or whatever social media platform you prefer is that we currently find ourselves in an era where we're in the weak men create hard times. Now, a lot of this is actually turns out based upon Neil Strauss and or Neil Howe's book and Strauss's book on generational theory. That was their first book, and the fourth turning, which was their second book. We're going to be mainly exploring the fourth turning here in regards to our discussion. But I guess a couple things I want to lead this discussion with is first, understand this is like a theory. So this isn't like a proven, this is a fact, this is a law of nature, this is a law of physics or anything like that. I do find it to be a very compelling argument. And if nothing else, it really is an interesting exploration of, do the times make the man? Does the man make the times? Or is there some sort of like correlation there in regards to it? So the first thing I wanted to share with you guys was just a couple of quotes. So this first one from Mark Twain: history never repeats itself, but it does often rhyme. And this is a sentiment that really hits home for me because it does feel like we can sort of see or observe certain patterns over the history of mankind, or at least recorded history. And then the original quote that I shared with you guys that became the meme, that's from, I believe, Michael Hopf, one of his fiction novels. I haven't actually been able to get deeper into where that quote originated. I suspect that it probably already existed, but that was the first reference of it I could find. So again, if you guys know where the quote hard times came from, let me know, because I'm just kind of interested as a internet sleuth. But when we're thinking about patterns, there really is patterns everywhere. And patterns dictate how most of us experience life, both in the micro and macro. Some common patterns most of us are likely familiar with are like the seasons of a year, right? So spring, summer, fall, winter. We've got the Pareto principle, right? For many outcomes, roughly 80% of consequences come from 20% of causes. You've got the Fibonacci sequence, the golden ratio, so on and so forth. So both in nature as well as math, we often kind of find or discover or observe these patterns, and they often have really significant implications. And so essentially, Howe and Strauss, in their book The Fourth Turning, which I recently just listened on audiobook, it's actually surprisingly a very short book too. So if anyone's interested in jumping into it, I think it's like a 4, maybe 5 hour listen. So actually, compared to most books in this field, I found it to be very condensed. I don't actually think, though, that you really need to read the book or listen to it to get the gist of it. I honestly think that quote or that meme sums it up in a pretty effective manner. We'll share with you a couple graphics in this video as well. But again, if you guys want to do a deep dive, I encourage you. It's a quick listen, but I don't think it's necessary to truly understand what they were trying to lay out here. So before we get into how essentially generations influence each other, let's first explore like an individual's life, because again, there appears to be a certain pattern that your average human being goes throughout their life. This is based upon actually Neil Howe's discussion with Tony Robbins. There's a link in the Substack article. So if you guys want, jump over there, watch it. It's a great watch, in my opinion. So we've got the spring of your individual life. That's from 0 to 20. So that's the childhood, learn. You're in a protected kind of coddled phase, right? It's all about creation, being protected, growth, absorb, learn. Then you've got your summer phase. That's 21 to 41. That's young adulthood. It's often when you're kind of discovering yourself, you're testing your limits. So test what is learned, decide what you will value. Time for relationships, kids, and family. And then the fall of your life season is 42 to 62, and that's midlife. So power and great harvest, reaping or weeping, time of power, impact, taking charge, unwinding of some relationships and career. Then we've got the winter, which is your elderhood. That's leadership. Again, mentoring, slowing down, laying foundation for next spring, which would be like future generations, your grandchildren, things of that nature, and clearing for next spring as well. So kind of preparing or laying the groundwork. Now, in the fourth turning, what they really explore is not only does this sort of pattern of 4 seasons apply to, the weather, not only, the weather, not only does it apply to our individual lives, but it also applies to like generational theory. So what they kind of lay out, and they get really deep into a handful of specifics that I don't think we necessarily need to explore in order for you guys to get the gist of this. But the big picture here is that we are entering a fourth turning according to them in their book. And there's something about that that just like rings true to me. And now a lot of their discussions do kind of border on being a truism, as in like it's something that kind of feels inherently true, but you maybe don't have a lot of empirical data to back it up. And later on in the discussion, we'll actually explore some of the main criticisms of the fourth turning and how Howe and Strauss kind of laid it out in their book. Because again, I want to really make it clear that this isn't guaranteed, right? What we're going to lay out here isn't guaranteed to happen. But when you look at the pattern of history, and when you think about that Mark Twain quote, it's really easy to think like, hey, yeah, it kind of feels like maybe we are entering a unique period in time. Um, so Strauss and Howe have theorized one of the major patterns of life, which is a reoccurring generational cycle in Western history based on the historical generations they examined, as a 4-stage cycle of social or mood eras, or the 4 turnings. The theory states that major historical events are associated with these reoccurring generational archetypes. These generational archetypes lead to a new era called a turning, often lasting 20 to 25 years. And again, if you notice even how society breaks up the past, right? We break it up into generations. Usually generations do last kind of in that 20 to 30 year time range. And in which during each one of these like turnings or generational periods, we get a new social, political, and economic climate ends up existing. So what they kind of describe this as is a saeculum. And a saeculum is the length of time equal to a potential lifetime. So about 80 to 100 years, right? Which again, that's 4 different seasons, breaks in nicely into that 20 to 25 year time horizon that they kind of laid out for all of us. So when we're looking at these, essentially, there's a couple ways you can try to summarize these patterns. So an average life is 80 years and consists of 4 periods of 20 to 22 years. So you've got childhood, young adulthood, midlife, and elderhood, as we laid out in the seasons of a life. Then we've got generations, right? So a generation is an aggregate of people born every 20, 25 years. So we've got baby boomers, Gen X, millennials, and homelanders. And that's what they refer to kind of the next generation coming up after millennials. Myself and Adam, we're millennials, but the generation following us, they frame it as homelanders. You may have also heard them referred to as like Generation Z, and there's a couple other terms that are thrown around. Then we've got each generation experiences 4 turnings. So we all live through 4 different turnings or 4 different seasons on this macro pattern. But what's interesting is depending upon where you are in the current saeculum, as well as like where you are in your period of life, dictates how you're going to experience that individual generational turning. And the way they frame this is those 4 turnings is the high, the awakening, the unraveling, and the crisis. And right now, according to them, we're transitioning from the unraveling into the crisis. And one of the reasons this book got so much attention when it originally came out and why it's getting so much more attention in the modern day is they predicted that by like 2020 to 2026, we were going to go through some really transformative periods of time. And so they predicted all this pre 9/11, just for context. The book was originally written before 9/11. And they predicted that we could see some sort of mass terrorism, as in like, and literally, I think they referred to planes targeting buildings, right? They also referred to we'd probably see economic instability. We could see like financial recessions or a market crash or something of that kind of level. They also explored the idea of pandemics. Now, obviously, all those things didn't happen between 2020 and 2026. However, we did experience 9/11. We did experience like the great credit crunch, right? The 2007, 2009 period. As well, we currently are experiencing the COVID pandemic. So there's certain things there that just kind of ring true that got this book a lot of attention. Steve Bannon has discussed the book. Al Gore has discussed the book. Again, there's been a lot of very powerful and influential individuals that have referenced this book at different periods in time. At the same time, there is a lot of criticisms or backlash. Now, a lot of the recent backlash is literally because Steve Bannon likes the book and has referenced it, which I'm not sure if that's a good enough reason to go after their concept here. But let's quickly explore those generational archetypes. So, high. The first turning is a high which occurs after a crisis. During the high, institutions are strong and individualism is weak. Society is confident about where it wants to go collectively, though those outside the majoritarian center often feel stifled by the conformity. Then we enter the awakening phase. So, this is the second turning. This is an era where institutions are attacked in the name of personal and spiritual autonomy. Just when society is reaching its high tide of public progress, people suddenly tire of social discipline and want to recapture a sense of self awareness, spirituality, and personal authenticity. Then we enter the unraveling. This is the third turning, and it's called the unraveling. The mood of the era, they say, is in many ways the opposite of a high. Institutions are weak and distrusted, while individualism is strong and flourishing. Then the fourth turning is the crisis. This is an era of destruction, often involving war or revolution, in which its institutional life is destroyed and rebuilt in response to a perceived threat to the nation's survival. Now, I think it's really easy to hear that at face value and almost not even follow along with it or kind of nod your head along the way you would with truisms. But when you get a little bit deeper into the examples they lay out, this is what really hits home to me. So we've got, if we're looking at like previous fourth turnings, we've got the World War II, I should say, or even like the World War periods. But the way they frame it in the book is the Great Depression and World War II was the fourth turning that we most recently experienced from 1929 to 1945. If you go back roughly 80 years from there, you had the Civil War. If you go back roughly 80 years from there, you have the American Revolution. If you go back 80 years from there, you've got the Glorious Revolution. 80 more years, you've got the Armada Crisis. And you go back 80 more years, you've got the Year of Roses. I guess when I saw this laid out, and I think this is what really convinces a lot of people to start taking this seriously, is you're like, hey, shit, it really does seem like there's a lot going on every 80 years. I guess first thing I'd like to explore with you, Adam, is just, had you ever thought about this? Had you really ever heard of the fourth turning before we kind of brought it up as a subject matter to explore? And as you see this laid out, do these feel like some of those, peak crises over the last few centuries?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree that these are, peak crises, or certainly crises that involved a lot of people. Particularly, if we look at the most recent one there with World War II and the Great Depression, like we're talking about literally countries everywhere being affected by this. And I'd never actually heard of this book, but I'm obviously very familiar with that meme of the strong man create great times and stuff like that. And I'm very familiar with that cycle. I've looked into before, like the rise and fall of empires, but that's on a bit of a larger timeline, I would think. But certainly, even just seeing these ones here, like, God, I haven't thought of the War of the Roses for a long time. And so even just seeing these laid out and how tightly in succession they are to this model is definitely interesting.
And again, as you kind of like view it through the lens of generations, there's also something about that where you're like, ooh, maybe we do kind of like forget history to a certain extent every 80 years, hence being doomed to repeat it. And again, that constant Mark Twain quote is always in the back of my mind when we're talking about the fourth turning, that history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. And that just, that always hits so strong with me in regards to when we're exploring these things. And I just wanted to highlight here this tweet that lays out again kind of an interesting infographic chart sort of thing that lays out the different periods of time, how those were experienced, and the different generations that kind of were impacted by it as well. So I'm mainly going to focus on the more recent ones here on screen, but we've got the silent generation, right? The generation that kind of grew up during the Great Depression and World War II. Then we had the boomers, then we had Gen X, and then we had millennials. And that essentially would round out a fourth turning cycle, right? Is these four generations and their personal experiences and where they were at. And one of the interesting things that I'll leave you guys to do your own research in is how, based upon what age your generation is and where we are in the four turning cycles, how that impacts them, right? So you'll have different generations that will be more, optimistic, more pessimistic, those that are higher trust towards institutions, those that are low trust towards institution, those that prefer safety, those that prefer individuality, right, and risk taking. And again, one of the main criticisms you'll often come across in regards to the four turning thesis is that it doesn't apply to every single person in a generation. And that's obviously true whenever we're looking at large bodies of populations, right? But there is that old adage that the exceptions don't make the rule. And that's what I really focus on is the aggregate here, right? Is there certain patterns? Is there lessons we can learn? Another great chart, if you just want to kind of explore further in detail the past and how these four turnings have played out previously. But let's quickly jump into the critiques of the fourth turning, because what I want to spend the bulk of our time on is actually exploring the implications here and kind of spitballing with you, Adam, whether those implications should impact us, whether we think that this feels in alignment with our personal experiences. But the fourth turning is regularly critiqued as being overly broad, not relying on empirical evidence, and not applying to every individual in a given generation. Many argue that other characteristics, for example, geography or political affiliation, have a greater impact than like a generational difference does. And again, that also does ring true to me, right? When we're thinking about someone that grows up in a blue city versus a red state, I think that those political affiliation and geography differences probably have as big of an impact as maybe the generational theory in regards to how that individual actually experiences life and kind of the roller coaster of life that they're going to go through. A couple other critiques I want to highlight here. So Frank Giannicola wrote an article in the Human Resources Planning that stated the emphasis on generational differences is not generally borne out by empirical research despite its popularity. And so this is, again, one of the big criticisms is that this kind of feels like pop science, right? Or pop psychology versus like them having tons of data. Now, again, you can lay out their generational theory, map it out onto different generations, and we can kind of see these different crises that do seem to play out in the Western world on an 80-year cycle. And again, a criticism you often hear is, well, that doesn't necessarily map on to every civilization's experiences, right? What about China? What about India? What about Russia? What about Africa or South America? And again, they really do take a Western centric and particularly American centric perspective on this. But that's also the society we live in. So it's the one that's most interesting to me and the one that has the most immediate implications for us as well. Another criticism I want to highlight is when you get past the rhetorical sound and fury, Michael Grunwald wrote in the Boston Globe, you realize that as a political document, the Declaration signifies practically nothing. And again, I don't actually really disagree with that statement because, as I mentioned at the start here, I don't even know if you need to actually read the book or listen to it in order to get the gist of it and have some of the big takeaways. And this to me is one of those things where even if you don't completely agree with it or even if you don't believe in it whatsoever, I think there is certain patterns that play out on a generational basis that still behooves us to be aware of and take into consideration whenever we're trying to track anything approaching a macro trend, right? Again, think about how the baby boomers influenced consumerism over the last 50 plus years. Massive, anyone that went to business school, you probably spent tons of time on case studies and understanding how, as the baby boomers matured, our economy matured with them lock and step. And so, again, just highlighting the last fourth turning, getting a little bit deeper. What were some of the experiences there so that we can transition into the so what's and how you guys can actually try to make the most of this lesson is the 1929 stock crash, right? So we had widespread economic hardship. We had the New Deal, which was widespread deficit spending. We had increase in regulation. That was during the time that the FDIC was formed, the SEC. We had dramatic increases in the income taxes, right? I think income taxes went from like 20% during the Great Depression to above 60% for the highest earner bracket. Then we also had World War II, which was a major geopolitical conflict. And the reason it's important to highlight this is if you buy into the fourth turning thesis, is understand that as they predicted and as the previous fourth turning showed, you would expect that in the next, let's call it the next 4 to 8 years, that we're probably going to experience widespread economic hardship. I could kind of make an argument that maybe we're already going through that with inflation, with some of the macroeconomics. We had, again, the New Deal, widespread deficit spending. Well, literally every Western nation is hitting new all-time highs in regards to their deficit, as well as their annual deficit spending. Increased regulation. Again, we literally saw a period of time, as we discussed in the first half of the show, where we were locked in our homes, right? When you couldn't get on trains or planes because of individual medical decisions here in Canada. And then finally, major geopolitical conflict. And I think a fair argument could be made right now that that may even be playing out, or the beginning of that is playing out in Ukraine, right, with the Russia-Ukraine conflict we're currently experiencing. I guess just when thinking about our modern day times to the last fourth turning, Adam, does that ring true? Do you think, is there a steelman argument or a red team, blue team to make against this?
Yeah, I mean, I think I kind of agree with these things. I mean, the things that you've just brought up, right? Conflict in Europe right now. We've got what's going on in Yemen. We've got Iran being very tricky. We've got China making interesting plays, right? And what's gone on with Taiwan and some of the things there. North Korea still being kind of funny. It's like when I look at all of this and then I start to see like things that like were born out of the original like war taxes and things like that during the world wars, like when that stuff starts and then it stays, I think that what ends up happening is we build this foundation of instability and then things layer on top of that continuously. And it's kind of like the Matt, you're a chartered accountant, or I'm not sure if you still hold that title, but yeah, once you did. And something that I'm sure you could share is like, hey, with like taxes, we never really take things back, right? It's like we'll create an addendum or some sort of addition to the tax code to deal with the issue that we can see in the existing tax code. It's like we never actually shrink things, we just add on top. And my problem is that it feels like a house of cards when we do that. And so from that perspective, I can really get behind the idea that like, yeah, like maybe we are kind of nearing the end of this cycle. And if this theory is correct, like, yeah, I could see this causing real crisis and creating real hard times. So I think I'm generally in agreement with this, and especially when we look at the timing of that 1929 stock crash and World War II and everything, like it feels right. Like it feels like a powder keg, and the fuse has been lit. But I have a question. I'm not sure if we're going to get into this later in the conversation, but I do wonder though, like what does technology do to this type of theory, right? Like when we have such fast information, when we have the ability to almost like a switch, change policies or change mandates or change and enact new things and put them into practice across like, billions of people very quickly. I do kind of wonder what effect that might have on this and if it might not even shorten these cycles. But
Yeah, and that's definitely an interesting exploration. I'll just make a quick comment first on your
mhm.
original point. I think when looking at like government bureaucracy or government oversight institutions, it's it's extremely rare, almost never in my opinion, that you'll see someone take like a first principles approach, as in like let's start over and start from the bottom up and make sure that that foundation we're building strong. In regards to technological innovation and how that impacts these things, there definitely is an aspect of that. I haven't gone deep down it, right, but if we look at World War II era, well, right before World War II, and if we group in the Great Depression as part of that fourth turning, you had the advent of radio telecommunications, right, which
Yeah.
allowed for broadcasting unlike anything we'd ever experienced before. We both saw, or we saw FDR and Hitler, and to a lesser extent, Churchill and Stalin, all utilize that communication, that means of communication, in order to really cause a lot of the volatility that was experienced in that fourth turning. If we go back a little bit further, right, I believe that you'll find that like the printing press would have been around the Glorious Revolution. So again, we have experienced certain like technological innovations that were dramatic in regards to their impact in like the macro. I think if we're looking at the Civil War, the one that comes to mind for me would be the advent of like modern warfare tactics, right? So that was the first time that you really saw like guns being used en masse in a large scale conflict. In fact, if I remember my history correctly, you had like Britain and Russia, right, sending over emissaries just to witness the warfare that was playing out, because it was the first time that we'd really seen warfare utilized in that manner during the Civil War. But it would be interesting to go back and see if we could almost peg a different technological innovation to all of them, because I'm not sure which one I would come up with the American Revolution. Although maybe there's something there to be said with like the French Revolution and just the idea of Republican states in the first place, right? But yeah, let's jump into some of the so whats, because I really do want to explore these kind of point by point. So the first one, according to Neil Howe, and Strauss has passed away subsequent to the writing of the book, so we can't like tap him in the modern day to get his perspective. But understand, a lot of previously successful investment strategies were dictated by previous generational social, political, and economic climates. And the big thing there is, again, understanding that during the individual generations as they lay them out, you'll have generations that are high trust and high belief in the existing institutions. You'll have other subsequent generations that come along that have low trust and a preference towards individuality, right, and individual sovereignty. And the economic climate and the political climate evolves during those different generations as they kind of peak and fall. And this one really hits home for me. The idea that, for example, what we've currently seen in the crazy run up in speculative investments such as NFTs or pre revenue business and crazy EBITDA multipliers was caused by previous economic climates of negative real interest rates. So again, as we said, during our like the previous unraveling phase, right, which would have been early 2000s up until kind of 2020, what we saw play out there was a lot of crazy speculation in the financial markets, and it's hard for me to not think that that was primarily driven by the consequences of those negative real interest rates, right? The fact that money essentially was free. However, if you were to buy into the fourth turning and buy into Neil Howe's kind of perspective on all this, we're currently transitioning into a different economic climate. And in the new economic climate, we're not going to see crazy low interest rates. And that's certainly something playing out right now in relation to what we're experiencing personally through inflation, as well as central banks' reactions to inflation, right? Earlier on in the first half of the show, we were talking about the Bank of England and the bond markets and things of that nature. And this really feels like, yeah, I think that, again, even if you don't buy into the fourth turning or that we're currently entering a crisis phase, I personally really still do buy into the idea that individual generations have a massive influence on how economic and policies and politics play out. Any thoughts there, Adam?
Yeah, I mean, I do believe that the free money that we've been experiencing for the last while. I mean, interest rates were, almost nothing here, at least in the real estate markets, and the same for automotive and any other type of consumer debt was extremely cheap, and that obviously led to inflamed demand and actually some of the highest real estate prices historically ever recorded, at least in our markets. And that drove like rampant consumerism that got a little bit out of hand. And now that that's turning around or changing, it seems ripe for a bit of a crisis mode to be entered, where people are going to run into real financial hardship, and that will translate into their social and romantic relationships and professional lives. And those have cascading effects. So I do agree that that is completely possible. And at the same time, your oldest generation that's sort of transitioning there, in this model into kind of elderhood or late elderhood is going to be very affected by this as well. If there's any change to the social programs that they have access to, if the change to their cost of living changes dramatically, like I think that this is how it happens, right? It affects everybody. And this is perhaps, how we see this truly go into a crisis mode that then could transition into something better. Like, we've talked a lot on the show about quantitative easing, quantitative tightening, and some of the various monetary and fiscal policies that the government's using. And perhaps if they're able to really get a hold on inflation, or perhaps if we translate into better technology, like a true hard money like Bitcoin, perhaps this leads into a new high, right? Where we actually do see our generation, the millennials, take advantage of, newer, better technology and some of those different characteristics that Howe talks about as we enter sort of these different phases. So, yeah. I mean, very interesting stuff. And I guess one question that I would want to know an answer to is like, how could this go any other way? Because I actually don't really know how it could go any other way than into a crisis mode right now. And so I guess that could prolong this transition, but I do think we're headed into that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I guess like how this could look differently would be as if we remain with a high level of trust in our institutions, if we remain willing to make sacrifices for the greater good, if we're willing to continue to defer to existing authority structures, that would probably alleviate a lot of the potential conflicts that would come out of like a crisis period of time. So I guess just food for thought on that, but
But
yeah.
one thing, sorry, Matt, I don't mean to cut you off, but one thing that scares me about that sentiment is what if we create that monster, right? And I think that that's perhaps one of the things that we did witness in, and I don't want to go down any conspiratorial paths here, really, but regarding like America around 2001, like they had a real and tangible monster to approach, and that was a massively unifying factor, but it also served as a backdoor for what many would call the military industrial complex, which is something that I think would greatly contribute to the crisis phase, right? And so it's almost a sleight of hand or a distraction. And I guess that would be one of my potential worries, is that like at any given point, any one organization, if they were large enough or persuasive enough, could create a monster of unity.
Yeah, so that'll maybe lead me down this tangent here, and we'll circle back to some of the other so whats. But I found this to be a really interesting aspect of the idea around the fourth turning, and that's the necessity of conflict. So if you guys will indulge me here, I think this is important. William James, and this is from 1910, in his essay, The Moral Equivalent of War, in 1910, explored the idea of whether we could have a shared objective that can elicit the same willingness to sacrifice and the same disciplined and purposeful ethos as a military conflict does, yet direct them towards entirely peaceful purposes. Can we sustain political unity and civil virtue in the absence of war or a credible threat? So kind of what you were laying out there, Adam. In the graphic novel Watchmen, which I'm a big fan of, Ozymandias, the smartest man on the planet, ultimately comes to the conclusion that the only one thing that can unite humanity and avert a nuclear apocalypse is an external threat like an alien invasion. And so, those of you that are familiar with the book, it's spoiler alert, but it's like a 30-plus-year-old book, is the idea that literally they create a false flag attack on New York that appears to be from aliens, so that the entire globe, and at this moment in time, it's U.S. and NATO essentially, and Russia, decide to come together in a peaceful manner to fight this existential threat that's outside of just like the whims of humanity. And building upon this concept of the conflict, this is why in the past we see so many wars announced by the state, whether it's a war on poverty, drugs, hate, terrorism. They're trying to elicit the same social habits the war does. So we've previously seen different governments and political entities try and create this moral equivalent of war, but try and do it through a more productive manner versus simply like a military conflict. In his 1906 speech, James explores the question: if you were to ask Americans right now in 1906 if they would have preferred to have not fought the Civil War, James bets that the vast majority would say that the Civil War was necessary, and without it, there is no way society would have progressed or developed as far as it has in 1906. And America would not be dynamic, affluent, and united as it was then in 1906. However, James notes that if you were to ask the same Americans if they want to fight a civil war now in 1906, they would all say no. Nobody enjoyed the Civil War, but it was something necessary for us to become who we are today. And that's one of the things that I think is a really interesting thought experiment in regards to those other fourth turnings that we discussed, right? Like, did we want to fight World War II? No. But honestly, if you were to ask anyone in modern day society, was World War II necessary? I think you're going to find the overwhelming responses like, yes, it was necessary. However, if you were to ask them, do you want to fight World War III today? All of us would say, like, no, we want peace. And this is one of the things that when you explore the idea of these patterns, right? And again, we see so many patterns in nature and just like the universe that it's hard for me to not wonder whether these patterns are, predestined, maybe the wrong language, but just inevitable. And, again, it may not look like a carbon copy of the previous crisis or the previous fourth turning, but as Mark Twain says, it's going to rhyme. It's going to look similar. So again, maybe you can stretch it an extra 10 years. Maybe you can speed it up 10 years. But at the end of the day, it almost feels like this might be one of those growing phases that we almost have to go through. And well, maybe it sounds absurd, or maybe it sounds like I'm just rationalizing here. I actually found a lot of peacefulness in that sort of concept. That this is just like, the caterpillar has to enter the cocoon in order to become a butterfly. Is this one of those things where there's just growing pains to society? And if we want to continue to see society progress, it's going to have to constantly reinvent itself. And honestly, it's probably going to take a crisis or a major conflict in order for us to give permission to society to truly reinvent itself in a radical manner versus the incremental changes or the layering on the house of cards, as you kind of mentioned earlier, Adam. So I guess anything on that before I circle back to the so what's?
Yeah, I guess this is sort of along the lines of exactly what I was thinking about, and I do actually wonder what effect that has. Like, do states build themselves back better and more trustworthy, or do they just find different and more cunning ways to avoid scrutiny longer? And or even just if we're talking strictly with Howe's theory, is that they find ways to live another 80 years, but that those ways were never inherently better. And I'm a little bit, I guess I don't like the symmetry or symbolism or poetry, the poetic nature of claiming right now, like with the conflict that's going on in Europe right now, like, did we need to fight World War II? Well, from where I'm sitting, maybe, like probably, but I don't actually know. Like I wasn't there. And I really am worried about how history will be written regarding some of the current events that we've just went through, like the COVID pandemic and like the conflict in Europe right now. And I guess I just don't fully understand. Like, if you ask me in 80 years, did we need to fight this conflict in Europe right now? I'm not sure what my mind would tell me or how I would remember it, but as I sit here, I don't think so. I don't think this conflict is entirely necessary, at least to the degree that it's going to. Um, and so I guess I'm just a little bit curious about this stuff and how technology will be used to expedite the process or lengthen it, and what different cunning ways, um, you know, we will find as individuals, as sovereign individuals, to fight the battle, and what cunning ways that the forces that play against us will find to remain in power for as long as they do, right? Like if it's on an 80-year cycle and distrust is the thing that transitions us into a different cycle, then like what sort of tools will they use, right? Is it national cyber security and spying on your citizens and lack of privacy? Is that a tool that we'll use to get another 80 years out of this game? Um, uh, or digital currencies, ESG scores? Like I just, to me, it's intriguing, right? And I wonder if we're any better off than, you know, where America actually was at those times. And I mean, obviously we enjoy a lot of benefits. Like you know, we don't have a ton of world hunger, or at least it's dramatically been reduced. You know, we're relatively safe. We have a lot of luxury and comforts, but I wonder if these cycles continue, at what point do these things ever stop? Or is there a point in which society is happy with the product that it has?
Sure. And there's a lot there. I guess in regards to does it create a better society on the other end of it? That's obviously extremely subjective, so I think it's
Of
difficult
course.
to accurately say that. But I think when you look back at like the last three turnings, so World War II, the Civil War, and the American Revolution, I like what William James was laying out there in his essay and his speech. That rings true to me. Is that those conflicts, while painful, also feel like a necessity. And I think one thing that, like, you know, not alternative history buffs, but those that maybe like are broader in scope in regards to their study of history are likely to come to the conclusion of is that like we've got this neat little manner of trying to oversimplify complex issues. And so a lot of people will say like America's been America since the American Revolution. However, I think those that are more studied in American history will say like, no, there's actually probably been like three American empires or three American political entities. And so you've got America from the Revolution to the Civil War, and that's one political entity. And essentially completely reinvented itself, right? Like you saw the suspension of habeas corpus by Abraham Lincoln, right? You saw really an increase in federal powers and a decrease or downplay of states' rights. And that's had like long term lasting effects. But a lot of people will argue that, you know, America right after the American Revolution, America right after the Civil War are completely different political entities. And like while they geographically, you know, maintain the same rough area, well, I guess it expanded post American Revolution, but like while it's still kind of geographically the same and maybe even made up of the same sort of citizenry, that it's actually like a completely different political entity. And the same thing holds true, right, in the post World War II era of where we saw a huge buildup in that military industrial complex, as you mentioned. And so I think it's difficult to give a subjective value judgment on it, but I do believe that we're probably going to come out the other end of this fourth turning with essentially like, for all intents and purposes, a completely different political entity when we're looking at the West or America. Now, whether that still falls under the umbrella of America or falls under the umbrella of NATO or under the umbrella of like Anglo-Saxons, we'll kind of see only with hindsight how the details of that play out. But that is really the way I kind of think about these things. And it's almost like, you know, getting old. You can't get mad at getting old. Does getting old make you better? You know, like again, it feels so subjective that it's difficult to really navigate those waters with any level of accuracy. So, again, I love this conversation and this exploration of ideas because it's so outside of the normal, in my opinion. Again, you'll hear people like reference the meme that I shared at the start of the show, but I think very rarely will you see people get in and explore the nuances of these. The next kind of so what point I wanted to hit on here was in the next turning, your networks, relationships, capital, and reputation will become very valuable as we are likely to enter a lower trust society. So having deep bonds is very important. And again, this is something that, like, given my political bent and biases, feels like yes, like that's just a check mark. I'm already bought into that. That even plays out to kind of why I bought and live at the Citadel now and things of that nature. And kind of piggyback on that second point is my third one. Focus more on local, less on global. Ask yourself, are you in alignment with the community you live in? And so I think for a long time, as long as you were in alignment with Canada, that's all that really mattered, right? Like as long as you were in alignment with the average Canadian, it's all that really mattered. But I think even with what we were discussing earlier on in today's show about Alberta and Saskatchewan and kind of the splitting of priorities from these different provinces, I think that we're likely to continue to experience that more and more. Obviously, you see that playing out in the States, right, as well, in regards to red and blue states, Florida and Texas versus a California and New York and things of that nature. The fourth kind of so what point here is politics will continue to become more polarizing. Nearly everything will be viewed through tribal affiliation, i.e., it's going to be less about your arguments and more about whether you're team blue or team red. And again, that feels very true right now. People will be less prone to persuasive arguments and will become more entrenched in their beliefs. So it's going to be less about arguing and nuance and reason, and it's going to be more about like, no, I've decided I'm pro-choice. There's nothing you could tell me that will change my mind about being pro-choice. Or I'm pro-life, and there's nothing you're going to tell me or that you could influence me to ever make me reconsider my position on that policy.
Yeah, I mean that seems to ring entirely true of what we've been seeing, right? I mean, even myself, I've been talking about recession and talking about these things not being sustainable for over a year now, probably a year and a half. And then we obviously did just experience like true polarization of ideas without any type of room or to breathe or have, logical arguments or at least critiques and criticisms of some of the mindset narratives that were being promoted around the COVID-19 pandemic. And I know it personally affected a lot of people that I know, and our relationships with other family members or friends, colleagues, and certainly it felt very polarized, and it felt almost out of control, which is the scary thing. And that's where I think your so what or your takeaway here, focusing on local and being in alignment with the community you live in and valuing your networks over necessarily your net worth, right, is going to be so much more important. Because in a society that's losing trust, the financial markets will be, devastated likely. And so you're going to lose a lot of those, those beans that you have on the scoreboard. But what's really hard to lose is your network if you properly cultivate it, and the people around you and their mindset, and the people that stay beside you as you transition out of that low trust society and back up to that rising society. I think that's like a truly powerful and meaningful connection to have, where it's very easy to lose money, right? I mean, we just saw Canadians, at least in our market, lose 20 to 25% of their equity in their homes almost overnight. And that disappears very quickly, but your connections and network they simply won't. It's much more sticky.
Well, yeah, and to like try and draw a parallel to the last fourth turning we experienced there in regards to like financial turmoil, think about the Great Depression, right? And there used to like there's those anecdotal stories of like the farm auctions, and where the banker would show up, right, and the auctioneer to sell off a farm, and literally the rule would be no one's allowed to bid on it except for the farmer that lost the farm, and they're going to bid $1. And that again really comes down to that relationship capital, right? Because those individuals were deeply tied into their local community. They're essentially able to create these social norms or this social pressure in order to drive that sort of response and reaction to like a bankruptcy auction. And
That's so
then
beautiful.
yeah, like certainly it's very interesting, right? And again, I can't help but find or think that we'll maybe find ourselves in a similar sort of culture for a period of time where again that very local network is going to be important. The final so what point I want to make here was in the next turning, would like this turning, culture and content is likely to become less transgressive. Culture becomes propaganda. Again, I think that it's very easy for me to naturally think of how mainstream media and mainstream politicians, right? And like you have to be on side of science and you can't question the science and all this stuff. But arguably the same thing's true with the right, right? Like there's certain almost golden calves that the right holds too. You can't question the Jewish state. You can't question, pro-life. You can't question, whatever their doctrine is as well. And I really do think that we're going to see a continued polarization, at least in our current era, our current turning towards all those things.
Yeah, I
So,
fully agree with that. And I think it's equally as absurd, some of the things that both sides hold as sacred cows, right?
mhm. And then just kind of touch upon, what are, again, some of the upsides of the fourth turning, as well as how will we know when we're leaving the fourth turning? So, how will you know when you're leaving the fourth turning and entering a new spring season? According to Howe, the climax of the fourth turning will not be subtle. It will be absolutely history changing. The structure of society is likely to change in a dramatic fashion. According to Howe, this climax catalyst is likely to either be external, which will unite us like a world war, or internal, which will divide us like a civil war. And again, right now, I still kind of feel like the jury's out on that. Is it civil war that will cause us to reinvent our society, or will it be a external threat? Right? Will it be Russia or China or aliens or a pandemic? We'll see how that all plays out. But there's definitely, depending on those two streams, it will really impact how society chooses to reinvent itself. Now, looking at some of the upsides, leaders are made in the fourth turning, right? So that's when you really see some of the greatest leaders of history step up, is during these crazy crises. As well, other upsides in regards to a fourth turning is our current biggest problems are likely to be solved during or right after the fourth turning. So usually it results in that climatic shift in society, which results in us either solving those problems or moving on, or like essentially ignoring those problems but moving on. Also, strong identities are forged through conflict, right? That concept of iron sharpens iron. And I think that we'll see a very strong generation come out the other side of this. We already went through the tangent, but again, if you guys haven't checked out that essay by William James, I'll really encourage you to do so, because it's so obvious that it impacted so much of modern day society, right? Like if you're looking at like Nixon and Reagan and their wars on poverty and their war on drugs and things like that, the reason that imagery is used is essentially trying to create that moral equivalency of a external conflict. So the fourth turning is not something to be feared or something that can be stopped. And I think that's one of the things that actually gave me comfort while studying all this and reading up on it, is, again, like getting old. Assuming you believe their premise and their thesis here to be true, this is going to happen. It's not up to us to try and stop this conflict. But what we can try to do is prepare ourselves and position ourselves to either weather that volatility or even make the most of that volatility. However, we can prepare and position ourselves to, I guess I literally already regurgitated my thoughts there. The fourth turning is the price paid to enter a new golden age. And I think that that's another big aspect there, right? Just the same way that, like, for a lot of people, whether it's high school or university, that's sometimes the uh, um, that's sometimes like the playground or the battlefield that you have to go through in order to reinvent yourself and reinvent your identity and start living more in alignment with who you personally are or personally want to become. And the last question I wanted to leave everyone with, and be interested to hear your thoughts on this, Adam, if you want to share: have you gone through a hardship that caused a personal transformation? And then would you want to go through it again? And this really relates to that idea of like conflict creates the conflict experience creates this reinvention opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody would agree that they've been through some hardships in their life, and I've always found that I come on the other end of hardship with an absolutely renewed, a renewed fire, right? Like, you know, as the phoenix rises from the flame, like I find it always come out of conflict with more focus, more energy, more drive, more motivation, greater sense of purpose in order to get after that thing that I want to change. And like, even right now, like tonight or sometime this week, I need to like have a really serious and hard conversation with some of the people on staff for the one real estate business that I've got. And it's like, you know, it's not going to be easy or fun for anybody, but it's the right thing to do. And everybody's emerging on the other end of it a stronger and better person, having gone through the experiences that we have. And I think that every time, every opportunity, I think that you can have to go through sort of that cycle of, you know, experimenting and attempting things, but basically the life cycle that was laid out here by Howe, right? Where like you're essentially a child and you're kind of creating, protecting, growing, absorbing, learning. Then you test what's learned and decide what you value. And then there's a time for power and impact and taking charge. And then finally you kind of mentor, slow things down, lay the foundation for next spring. Like when you have that opportunity to go through those cycles on almost anything, I believe that you should. And on the other side of that winter, I guess you should say, there will be new growth. And I know that we've experienced this in trying to create different businesses. And even if you fail at something, it's really fun because you get to take the lessons learned and you get to take all of that new knowledge and apply it to something on your next project or your next business or your next relationship, whatever that looks like. So absolutely, I have found that to be true. And I think what I'm most excited for about this talk is something you mentioned there at the end, which is just like, it's going to happen, right? And so whether it's an internal conflict or an external conflict that does shape our society as we move forward, I feel like I'm doing the right things, right? And working with you in working to share our story and share sort of our takeaways with the community that we want to build here with Best Day Ever. And like, I believe that is going to foster the network that we will want and need as we transition and find ourselves in that spring. So I think we're on the right path, and I'm just I'm excited and motivated to push down this path as hard as we can, and hopefully people will join us and pick up on some of the inertia that we have. So I'm yeah, I mean, I'm just excited, man. And I think just the concept of just letting go of the fact that, like, you know, we're not, Matt, you and I are most likely not going to change the outcome of society. So I'm not making any Abraham Lincoln speeches and getting, change on that scale at this point. So it's like, we may as well just accept that we need to control what is within our control. And I think that's where I'm at. And it is freeing. It's freeing to understand that, like, it's just going to happen. So we may as well be along for the ride.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of those sentiments. I think, again, even just looking at like a smaller example of that, right? Like, winter is coming. It's the fall right now. You can't fight against it. If you really dislike winter, you can prepare or position yourself to better weather it, right? That could be, having a big house that you can live in where you don't have to go outside, or that could be traveling down south to avoid it. But to try and literally fight winter itself is a truly fruitless battle, right? Like, there's no point to it. And the last thing I wanted to leave you guys with is just a quote from Neil Howe in regards to all of this. History shapes generations young, and then generations, as they get older, shape history. And that's going to always be true, in my opinion. And that's one of the truisms here, I think, from the fourth turning that just are constantly ringing in my ears when I think about it. So a reminder, guys, you can find this entire article that we were exploring with you in our Substack. It's completely free. You can subscribe for free. We've got comments turned on for free as well, so you guys can share your thoughts, share your opinions. I'd love to hear your hot takes. I'd also love to hear if you've been exposed to the fourth turning before, or if you believe in it now. How are you personally going to try and position yourself to weather any sort of volatility or make the most of it? Because again, this is the era when real leaders are born, and I think there's going to be crazy opportunities for those that are willing to roll with the times.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt. I would love to hear. I really genuinely would love to hear from the audience. Like, are you prepared for volatility? What does that look like for you? What are some of the strategies? Maybe you're doing things that we haven't thought about. And in that spirit, I should talk to you guys about what we're going to be talking about tomorrow on Best Day Ever, and that is the go bag. So tomorrow is going to be our show on random hobbies and interests, and we're going to be covering the go bag. And if that's a term that you're unfamiliar with, the go bag is essentially a form of preparation that you can employ for, at your house, in your vehicle, on your person, in order to be able to be prepared for almost any situation in case there is an emergency or, something where you need to help others. So I'm going to be covering the go bag with you at length and in detail, and just giving you a little bit of my opinion on why I think it's something important that you should actually have, and why I don't think it's actually something crazy that, you have to be a conspiratorial, nut job or tinfoil hat to have. I think it's actually a very practical thing that you should have for you, yourself, your family, your neighbors, your community, and anybody else around you that you may run into while you're out and about in the world. The world is a volatile place, whether or not we're in the fourth turning or not. It's just simple that you can't always control what's going on in your environment, but you can control how prepared you are. So tomorrow I will be covering the go bag with you guys and sharing with you some of the tips and tricks that I've actually employed in my life, and the level of preparedness that I have with me on a daily basis. And with that, Matt, I think that brings the end of the show. So we'll see you guys back tomorrow morning. Holy smokes. At 12 noon. And of course, you guys can go watch all these replays on Rumble. You can join our Substack. We've also got a Telegram group where we do encourage, again, like Matt said, all of you to participate in the conversation. We are so looking forward to when you guys start engaging with us and talking to us in our Telegram chat and on the Substack. So until then, see you guys tomorrow. Cheers.
Thanks, guys.
They say life is what you make it. So what happens if you actually try? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die, cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually tried to get your mind right? What if you actually tried to live the high life? What if you happen to die, cause life is finite? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? What if you actually grind out when the time's right? What if you actually blinded by your hindsight? What if you actually find out what defines life? What if you actually tried to live your best day ever? I'm getting 1% better every day. I'm getting 1% better every way. I'm waking up every day to a sunny day. No matter what the weather say, life is like a record, so just let it play.